Hello and welcome to Hoarder Homes, Piles of Hazards for Firefighters. My name is Ryan Pennington, firefighter paramedic from Charleston, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to this program on fighting fires inside conditions caused by compulsive hoarding disorder. A brief introduction about myself is I'm a career firefighter here in Charleston, West Virginia, and I started my career in 1994 as a volunteer firefighter. Progressed all the way up till in 2007 I accepted a position with the Charleston, West Virginia Fire Department, where I've been serving proudly since. And it was during this service with Charleston that I kind of stumbled upon this topic of fighting fires inside compulsive hoarding disorder homes. As I was making my runs on the ambulance, I started noticing that the cluttered environments were happening more often. And the first thing that came to mind was, my gosh, what would happen if this place were to ever catch on fire? Well, it wasn't that particular home that I was in. It wasn't the next one. It was the third or fourth one. We ran back-to-back structural fires inside hoarding conditions. And then the third fire inside the cluttered environment caused by compulsive hoarding disorder was a fire with confirmed entrapment. They knew that there was a live victim in there as he was on the telephone with them. And during the process of removal of the victim, we sent 4 firefighters to the hospital, 2 maydays, and it ended up a bad outcome for the patient. It took 30-some minutes to get him out. And that kind of started the wheels turning in my head about how we go about adjusting our tactics inside these cluttered conditions. Since 2009, I've been writing the blog and articles, Views from the Jump Seat. And that's where I started sharing my information that I was learning about the hoarded environment. One article came into 2 articles, 2 articles came into 3, and before you know it, I was receiving my first invitation to travel and teach fighting fires in hoarder houses. A little bit about the Charleston Fire Department. We are a career fire department with 176 members, proudly serving a daytime population of 50,000. And that swells to about 150,000 during the bustling times of the day. But in this house and during this rescue, it kind of dawned on me that we probably need to be making some adjustments for hoarding conditions. So I took to Google and I looked up the different types of research. I typed in hoarder fires, nothing. Fighting fires in Collier's mansion conditions, nothing. Tactical changes of dealing with hoarding conditions, nothing. So that's when I started reaching out and talking to the fire departments now around the world about what kind of challenges they had faced, what type of successes they have had with battling these types of structural fires. So since 2012, I've really kind of started the research with case studies and line of duty deaths and near misses where I can study and share this information. So we start our program with what is hoarding. Hoarding, or compulsive hoarding, is the accumulation of and failure to discard a large number of objects that seem to be useless or of limited value. This extensive clutter in the living spaces prevents the effective use of the space, and it also causes significant distress or impairment caused by the hoarding. This is where the folks start feeling their homes full. And a lot of common stereotypes is that hoarder homes are always completely full. That is not true. Hoarding comes in different levels. It comes in different stages. And we'll talk about the levels here shortly, later on in this section of the program. But first, we need to understand some common findings that has presented itself through my research. Number one, 2 of the places that these folks start their collections or accumulations and storage of their stuff is often the attic spaces and the basements. So we need to keep that in mind if we choose to go inside one, but it also has kind of discovered that the last 2 places that these folks store their belongings is the kitchens and bathrooms. Now, how would this affect your search at 3 o'clock in the morning in a known hoarding environment if you already knew that that occupant had 2 spaces that they could be living in or have used as a room of refuge to get into. That could really adjust our search patterns and where we begin our search, because often once this collection accumulates so high, they no longer use their bedrooms as bedrooms. They don't watch television in the TV room. Their spaces get so packed that they can't use them for their normal functions. And we'll talk about the levels of it here coming up shortly. But it's been today's reality television. Today's reality has exposed that the hoarding is a growing epidemic in America. And since starting this research, I could expand this out to the world. Hoarding is believed to affect between 700,000 and 1.4 million people. This number is extremely low. They have only been researching compulsive hoarding disorder for approximately 15 years. And up until 2013, they had classified these compulsive hoarders as OCD. But what they found was you can be OCD and not be a compulsive hoarder, and you could be a compulsive hoarder and not have OCD. So in 2013, compulsive hoarding received its own diagnosis from the psychological community in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders. What does that mean to us? Well, it means that now that it has its own disorder, we hope that it opens up grant funding to study this, because as the fire service, we've never really studied hoarding homes or hoarded fires before. There's only been one fire department that's actually done a study in hoarding fires, and that's the Melbourne, Australia Fire Department. And we'll introduce you to the Melbourne study here shortly. But as a fire service, we haven't been documenting this. And I don't do the run reports at my house or at my station. But the folks that do tell me that, Ryan, there's no button to click that says cluttered. There's no hoarding diagnosis or hoarding classification in their run report. So we really don't know how often we're seeing fires in hoarding conditions. Good thing about the television show is it brought the bright lights of Hollywood onto this disorder. But the bad thing is that the television show is only 60 minutes minus commercial. And a lot of folks kind of assume that this is a quick, easy fix. And it's not. It's quite the opposite. It takes a lot of time with different folks involved to help treat these people that are afflicted with compulsive hoarding disorder. It's not reality television anymore. It's the fire service's reality. It's not a matter of if you go into a hoarded environment. It's a matter of when, because they can be found in anyone's district. This is not an American problem. This is not a Canadian problem. This is a worldwide growing issue. It doesn't happen just in West Virginia where I live. It's happened all around the world, from the London Fire Service to the Melbourne, Australia Fire Service to the Asian population. Compulsive hoarders can be found in anyone's district. It's not a rich problem. It's not a poor problem. It's not a black, white, Puerto Rican, Asian. That affects all social, economic backgrounds, and it can affect any of us. So are you prepared to dig in when these folks can't dig out? Because there is no 912, as my good friend Billy Goldfeder would say. They're there for us, and we're there to help save them. Some interesting hoarder facts. Hoarding occurs between 2 to 5% of all adults. Guys, put away your egos for a few minutes, because it afflicts more men than women. But on the opposite, women seek help more often than men, and they think that this is what skews the numbers in research. It occurs over all income levels. Here's the problem, is most people that are afflicted with or affected by compulsive hoarding disorder don't want found out. They don't want you in their home. They don't want their family members in their home. They're very reclusive. They stay to themselves so much that you don't see them very often coming out of their homes. So these numbers are most likely low, because we don't know how many folks truly are afflicted with compulsive hoarding disorder. Some of the questions that often gets asked about hoarding is, why do they collect these things that you and I would say has no apparent value? Number one, it's caused by deep emotional trauma. They've had some sort of a deep emotional detachment or happenings in their life that makes them start clinging to and hanging on to these types of belongings, whether that be a loss of a child, a loss of a parent, bitter divorce, loss of a job. This is what makes the compulsion to collect begin. By collecting these items, they receive very positive feelings. They assign great value to their possessions, whether that's possessions of a stack of books, magazines, or just trash sometimes. At the same time, they have a great difficulty in discarding their stuff. They can't throw anything away. Eventually, this leads to a large amount of disorganized clutter. What items do they hoard? How does their collection begin? Well, some of the most common items that you'll find inside the hoarding conditions are paper, containers, newspapers, books, DVDs, furniture. There can be a collection of anything. Some of the more interesting cases that I have found in my research is a Christmas light hoarder. They hoarded Christmas lights. Talk about an entanglement hazard. A ferret hoarder. I experienced that one firsthand. We were treating the patient in a very not nice environment, and they had dryer vents ran from room to room. And as we was treating this very septic, very sick patient, the ferrets would zoom through these dryer vents. So it was like Maverick and Goose was buzzing a tower as we're down there treating this very ill patient. And that's where you can run into some serious biological effects of compulsive hoarding disorder, which we'll cover here in a few minutes. Take a look at that picture on your screen right now. Do you think that you could fight a fire in those conditions? Do you think you could perform a rescue in those conditions if the fire dynamics allow you to? Be careful with if you choose no, because we're going to talk about this environment still pretty manageable, as the doors are still open, the windows that you possibly could bail out still fairly open. This is still probably a manageable environment if you have the risk to go inside it. And the risk would be a known living victim, which we'll talk about here just in a few minutes. So what are some risk factors that people can have or help them develop compulsive hoarding disorder? Number one, it's a family history. People are more likely to hoard if they come from close family members who engage in compulsive hoarding. Makes perfect sense to me. I get most of my values from my parents. So if I'm raised in a hoarding environment, I can see the mindset of why I should collect and hang on to these belongings myself. So much so that they have created support groups called Children of Hoarding to support these family members and break the cycle. So that way we can stop the hoarding before it affects the next generation. Stressful life events seem to be the most or number one cause of compulsive hoarding. A lot of times it doesn't have to be a really huge event. It could be as much as losing a marriage or losing a job that makes them start collecting their belongings. Some common hoarding myths. Hoarders are lazy. Actually, some of the folks that I have seen in the research are very well off, very well educated men and women in their community, doctors, lawyers. Some of them are very, very smart, but they're very reclusive. They stay in their homes. They have very little social skills. Cleaning the house out does not work. If you go to someone's house on a medical call and you call in the fire inspector, the fire marshal to come in and clean out their house without treating the underlying causes of their hoarding, it's been proven that when they discover their collection of treasures is gone, that they can have enough stress on them to cause a heart attack. Hoarding does not affect only the poor. Who actually would have more resources for collecting stuff? A poor person or a person that had a little bit more money? And a common myth about hoarding is that hoarders are selfish. That's why they're collecting all this stuff. It's actually quite the opposite. They enjoy buying the stuff for people and they receive the positive feelings from it. But just the opposite of it, they can't get rid of it because the negative feelings come when they try to gift that item away. One of the primary dangers and points that I really want to get across to you folks is that interacting with the occupants can be kind of challenging. Number one is we can't be judgmental. Do we think their house is full of trash? Yes. Do we think it smells like cat urine? Yes. Is this something that we need to communicate to them? No. We need to be understanding of the complexity of this disorder. We want to be very respectful. What business are we really in? We're in the customer service business, and these folks are customers just like we are. You want to try to avoid touching their stuff at all possible. Now you're saying, Ryan, how can I get inside these homes without touching something? Well, we want to try to use the pathways if at all possible. And if we do have to touch their stuff, we'll say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry that I had to touch your stuff to get in here, but my bag was kind of swinging wide, and I'll put it back. We don't want to be opinionated, and we also don't want to use a term such as hoarder, pack rat, or filth. Just imagine, if you will, if you go into a fire and I'm inside it as a jump seat riding firefighter, and I'll call back to my incident commander. Chief, this is Pennington. We've got a pack rat hoarder house in here. And the occupant of the home is standing beside the chief. Who do you think's going to receive some angry feedback? It's going to be the chief. And it's actually been documented that they have such compulsion with hearing this, it can be a violent response to hearing these terms. That's why we don't want to use the term of hoarder. We don't want to use a term such as pack rat. We want to have a common terminology. Why? Because words can hurt. Some of the common terms that I've heard since I've started this research is pack rat conditions, a hoarder, trash house, or hey, this is just a filthy environment. The picture you're seeing here is from Long Island. This is pretty much a level 4, level 5 hoarding case of a working structural fire. Some of the common misconceptions is that these hoarder fires automatically blow up and get huge. Look at the picture you see in this slide right here. How big do you think that fire was? How much stuff is really burned? It's just the surface area that had the fire on it. That's why these fires have the potential for smoldering and burning longer. Because you've got the heat, something's been on fire, you've got plenty of fuel. What are you missing in there? There's no real airflow. And we'll talk about the dynamics of a hoarder fire just shortly. I want to introduce you to the most famous case of hoarding ever seen or ever documented. And that's the case of the Collier's mansion. The Collier brothers lived at 128th Street in Manhattan. They were both very well educated, and they were also children of hoarding. Their parents were collectors. Homer and Langley Collier lived on the corner of 128th Street in Manhattan. They were classic examples of compulsive hoarding. They had stacked their belongings so high they could not use the front door anymore. The code enforcement officials had came and turned their electric off. One of the boys was a good engineer, and he brought in a Model T Ford in a failed attempt to make a generator. They had no water service to the house, and over time, the amount of belongings had caused some dilapidation issues, so they tried to evict the Collier brothers. The other brother's a pretty good lawyer, and they were able to hold off the eviction and repossession of their house. These two gentlemen had so much compulsion to collect and protect their belongings, they actually had booby-trapped their stuff. Over time, the gentlemen had went missing for a number of weeks. They weren't seen very often. They came out of their house very often at all. They had become older. Homer died of natural causes. He had diabetes, and he actually starved to death because Langley at the time was bringing his food to his brother. They couldn't find Langley. He had been missing for a week. They actually sent out a missing persons report, and they sent the police officers in to check out inside the home where they had found that Homer had died of natural causes. They couldn't find Langley. But as they started removing this stuff, they found that Langley had been killed by his own booby trap. Both boys were half eaten by rats, and they were found inside their home. As they tore the house down, they found 136 tons of belongings, over 20,000 books, 8 grand piano, and a human skeleton that was not one of the boys. One of my classes out in Missouri this year said, That was probably their mama. We just want to save mama. We'll put her up there by the grand piano. So up until this day in New York City, they use the term Collier's Mansion conditions. If you were to turn on the scanner right now and listen to the FDNY, you would hear the battalion chiefs and the firefighters commonly use Collier's conditions. One reason that I want to try to get away from using that terminology is not all firefighters have really heard that terminology. It can also be confusing to the folks that hear this radio report thinking that it's a mansion. Or if you're in the DC area, maybe it's a McMansion. Or maybe if you're Scooby-Doo, you're headed to the mansion to check out the ghost. Whoa. So Ryan, what kind of terminology would you use to define hoarding conditions? When I first started this research, I reached out to a really good friend of mine who's in the brain business, Dr. Gasaway. And he said, Ryan, we need to make a trigger term for incident commanders to start thinking. And that's where we came up with the term heavy content environment. Heavy content environment. I'll explain later why we chose that term. But for now, think about heavy content environment.